Yay, all the buttons are pushed. Okay, welcome to all of you out there. Yesterday was Mother's Day in the United States, and we had talked about this a couple of months ago, very briefly, but we wanted to do or have a conversation about mothers and grief. And that's a pretty broad topic. So there's probably a lot to move into. And so first I'd like to introduce you to the other part of my conversation, Sandra Hunter. She is a fabulous woman and a woman of many talents. I think of her as an artist on many levels. She's a wordsmith, she's a writer, puts exquisite photographs of these places of beauty that she finds. She shares those with the world. You've made a book, right? With bridges, with visuals and words.
Yeah.
Do you do any other visual arts?
Not that we should talk about. Those are very experimental. I think let's just stick to what we can actually allow the public to see. So,
And you are a woman of many talents. You were a paralegal, right? At one point,
yeah.
you work with women, you mentor women in the workplace. You
Mhm.
also mentor women on self-regulation within the
Yeah.
workplace and within racial dynamics or power dynamics within work situations, as well as, oh, help me with the next parts. I
So
know
it's
you,
interesting. I mean, I feel I should leave now. We've talked about everything, but the when you're talking about those various parts, working with women, particularly women who are marginalized in workplace situations, and it may not be overt. This can
right,
be covert marginalization. And then you talk about all the other bits, which is to do with mentorship and to self-regulation and even to do with writing and photography. All of those intersect,
mm-hmm,
sorry.
mm-hmm.
So there's a real tessellation of those pieces that go together from various parts of my life. Even the dreaded time of being a paralegal, that had a lot to do with how much I witnessed the marginalization of women and women of color in the workplace. So that was probably formative in that part.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you're a boulder, rock climber, right, which helps you, I'm sure,
Yes.
process or assimilate a lot of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think I like bouldering and climbing so much is because you can't think of anything else
Right.
while you're doing it. You have to hold on or fall off and die. Well, not necessarily die if you're in a bouldering gym, but there's a lot of focus there of getting from one hole to the next hole. And I like that because it's problem solving, but it's also very focusing. It can really clarify. It has a cleansing and clarifying effect.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I find that it's interesting because I find that I do love going out in nature. It's one of my favorite places. But if I can't go outside, um, I think as the years have passed, before it was yoga, because yoga could,
Mm.
I mean, I want to say yoga was the place because it's so directive, right? There is a lot of direction. And so you can't think of other things. And I've moved more now into less directive, more inquisitive, and that is also fascinating because it's like,
Yeah, what I love about your yoga practice, and for your people out there who haven't enjoyed this with Padma, sign up, go to her yoga classes because they are amazing. You invite dialogue in yoga. So, the idea of moving away from directive completely makes sense because you invite somebody into an experience and then that's shared. It's not, well, now you've completed this, let's do the next thing. It becomes a whole dialogue, a whole story. Having gone through that myself with you, it's amazing.
yeah, and I like both, right? Because there's one that's much more, it's using our whole body, right? And
Mm,
something about physical effort, right? There's something about having your whole body engaged and
mm,
all your senses alive and awake
right.
in order to do what you're doing. And then there's as much heightened sensation, I guess I have found. I don't know if I would have been able to find that when I was younger, of
Mm.
finding as much dynamic engagement doing slow movements.
Right. But I think the difference between your teaching and engaging is so different from others. I mean, there have been times when I have just left a yoga practice online, not in actual real life, but online, because I just can't do the 50-second vinyasa. I just don't want to do it anymore. I want to do something that's a little bit more thoughtful.
Mm-hmm.
And and the slowing down process forces us in your yoga classes, forces us into breathing in those spaces where you get a chance to not rush on to the next thing. So I really appreciate that about your classes.
Yeah. And so it's a good segue because I do think there's something about this point of focus,
Mm,
right? We wanted to introduce grief, and I do think that there is different ways in which we can hold grief,
mm,
right? And these are two of the ways, right? There is that kind of physical engagement or physical challenge or that heightened sensitivity, um, as well as, because I think that they almost go together in a way, or I'm feeling them right now going together, just in that learning one skill more externally and then bringing it internally, and vice versa. There are times where I've needed to just do very still meditative work to then move out into a very busy, detail-oriented work situation. So it's
mm.
like how to hold the different aspects of ourselves.
I'm so glad you mentioned that word hold, because I think that with loss, with grief, and I was just thinking about what you were saying about, are these two facets, shall we say, the movement, the stillness. I think grief holds us
Hmm.
at the beginning, and there has to be, not has to be, but there is a shift in that relationship, in that dialogue eventually, so that you are not held by grief. Because when you are held by grief, you have no agency, you have no input. It's just being tumultuously propelled from one moment to the next, right? It's like, those kilns where they polish precious stones. It's like that, you're just being tumbled over and over, being battered by everything, and there's no space for thought at all. You're just being propelled by feeling, just feeling waves and waves of feeling.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Um, I think the first time my mom died when I was 25.
Mm, very
So
young.
that was a huge, yes, the grief was incredibly overwhelming and all encompassing. And and there were times where it felt like there was no outside experience. Like
Yeah.
people, I think the only thing I could say to people, especially for the first year, was they would say hi, and I would say my mother died.
Yes.
That's the only answer I had.
Yes. You'll see this with I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just wanted to correlate that back to our childhood experiences. When something happens, and hopefully, the child has been brought up in an environment where they are encouraged to speak, the child will tell the story of something that happened over and over again. They will tell it until it takes its place in some safe spot where it can be just referred to rather than told. I remember my little cousin Katie. She went round to my uncle's house, and he kept chickens. And she put her finger through the cage, and of course the chicken pecked her, and she was outraged. She was absolutely outraged. And she pecked my finger, peck my finger. And she just told this over and over and over again for everybody who came into the house, until it took on, it
Yeah,
diminished the
yeah,
emotion. So maybe
absolutely.
it's the retelling that diminishes emotion.
Well, I also think that it's interesting as you say that it helped me just kind of feel into it. I like feeling into things, kind of things that I've already gone through. Um, I didn't, I couldn't process it.
Mm-hmm.
Like there wasn't, because I think grief is very nonverbal in some ways, in many ways.
Yeah.
It's a process, right? It starts maybe as one thing and it moves and it changes, and maybe it's like complete fatigue and not being able to get out of bed, or maybe it's just sobbing and crying, or maybe it's screaming and yelling, whatever it is. And I've had all of those.
It's very primal, right?
It's very primal. It's not cognitive. You can't
Mm-hmm.
rationalize it. It just comes up like a storm in your body, and it just moves the way that it moves when it moves.
I so agree with this. I just want to go back to something I just said, which is said, the telling of it diminishes the effect. I don't think that's right. It doesn't diminish the effect. It doesn't diminish grief. It clarifies grief.
It helps to. It
And
helps.
then you learn where that is. I mean, I think of I think this, I think we talked about this as grief, as, your life as a little bay, let's say, along a coastline where it's a calm sea and it's
Mm.
very wonderful. And then grief arrives like somebody decides to build a 300-foot lighthouse in your bay. And that's, this is going to be useful. You're going to learn, wonderful things from this experience of having the lighthouse. But all you can do is just, look at this thing that's taken over your life.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And I would say that it's been almost 30 years that my mother has been gone, and it still feels like I'm in my grief journey. It
Yeah.
feels different. It
Mm-hmm.
feels very different, and there's lots of I also feel her, and I
Mm-hmm.
feel the change in her. Like I feel how she has changed.
Mm-hmm.
She's left the body. I feel like our relationship has changed. And and it's just fascinating to me. I mean, my dad died maybe a year and a couple months ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt a very similar process with him. Like I could feel him sorting stuff out. Like
Mm-hmm.
he
Okay.
went through a period of recognition of his behavior, recognition of his life, recognition of his wrongs, recognition of regret. And especially in relationship to our contact, our connection.
Yeah.
And so I think that's um, an amazing aspect of loss, of transition. I mean, especially with another person, it's probably very different with other kinds of loss. I know we spoke briefly about the other kinds of loss and grief, like the grief of becoming a mother, right?
Yes.
We are both daughters and we are both mothers.
Yeah.
And there that's a whole different thing. Those are more relationships within ourselves in some ways. So this
Right.
relationship with somebody that we have lost, a person that
Yeah. I mean, I'll come back to mothers and the idea of us as daughters, but we talked a little bit about the loss of self, right? You're talking about the relationship with self, what I was. Women go through these extraordinary transformational periods throughout their lives. You hit puberty, and then you hit a period, and then you eventually have love affairs, or you're having love affairs, and then you have a child, and then you go through menopause. It's constant. No wonder women are so adaptable. That's all we ever do is adapt through our entire lives. It's adapt or die. But there's also that thing where women are supposed to immediately feel this overwhelming sense of motherhood when they have a child. And I don't know about you, but I didn't. And I was horrified at myself. I wasn't in love with my child. I mean, I am obviously now. I've known her for 25 years, but um, I wasn't when she was first born. I
mm,
didn't know what I thought. I thought she was beautiful for a baby. She looked nice, but I wasn't sure that I thought, oh my goodness, am I the wrong person to be doing this because I'm not in love with her?
Just
And
the,
I'm annoyed she's taking up a lot of time. So I think there's a lot of guilt associated with becoming a mother, as well as, the loss of self.
yes, I agree. It's so interesting. The other day I was in a practice session for something, and there were a lot of moms there, a
Mm,
lot of new moms with very young babies, like all less than a year old, and some of
mm,
them pretty new, a couple months. And one of the women, she just said to one of the other mothers, um, early motherhood is one of the loneliest times that there is. And I just want to acknowledge that for you. And I just want to show my support,
mm.
and even just the recognition that it's not always easy. And I was like, that is one of the most mature things I've ever heard.
I love that.
People give really interesting advice when you're pregnant, when you have a baby, they give lots of advice. But just the honoring, that recognition of how hard it is, especially in this culture where there's this expectation for women to do it all.
I
Like
mean,
I
I love this. I love this concept of loneliness because, I remember the nights Alia had colic for 6 months, almost 7 months. And I remember being up at night with her, 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock, trying to comfort her and get her through the crying so that she could feed. Once she quiet and she could feed, and then she'd be okay. And it was, I didn't have a terribly supportive partner in um, that particular sphere. Um, and it was incredibly lonely. But I remember going through the mall, the shopping mall. I lived in Southern California for a while, and I she didn't want to be in the stroller, so I was holding her with one arm, pushing the stroller with the other hand. There was, some shopping that we had done in the mall, and I was getting into the elevator, and this woman looked at me and she said, "They do get older." And I was so grateful because I felt so miserable and so lost, such a sense of failure consistently. And I think that ties into this idea of loss on a day-to-day basis, on a more general basis, rather than this, birth is a human, really tremendous event, but then there's the day-to-day stuff about it. And I think that sense of failure, that sense of, I didn't sign up for this and I'm
Yeah,
doing a really bad job.
because it is hard. It is hard. They're on so many levels, right? The changes in the body and the pain. Like
Mm,
not the pain during. I didn't have as much pain during, and I think that had a lot to do with my accident when I was younger, which was probably the one of the most painful things I've ever been through. So
mm.
childbirth, in contrast, was I kept waiting for, like, even my midwife wouldn't come because she's like, you can still talk to me. You sound calm. You're not in labor. And
Yeah.
at one point, my friend was like, I think we need to go to the hospital because there was obviously something going on. And we went, and it was almost ready to go.
Oh
So
wow. Yeah.
there was there was something about, just not knowing. Um, but I love what you said about that the days are long. They're really long.
Hmm.
You have a child. And even just tying it back to the grief part, you can't, well, I mean, I was alone. I was a single mother, and that was a choice, but you can't, you think about, how am I going to go to the bathroom? How am I going
Right.
to shower? How am I going to put this baby down? How am I going to, like, your whole day is no longer yours to choose exactly, right? Getting to the grocery store. How do you get to the grocery store? And they wake up and they're crying, and then you can't do what you need to do. You can't get them you can't get the whole baby seat in the cart, and all the things. It's
All
like,
the logistics. I remember being in a department store. It was my ex-spouse's birthday, and we had to go and buy him something. And Alia was just bringing down
Yeah,
the house at that point.
yeah.
And all I could do was, it was one of those central islands where they had the cash point and they had, the people who were working. I think they might have had some men's products there, but it was this little island. So what I would do to try and calm her was I was running laps around this island, and I would throw down my credit card, and then I would come back and sign the receipt and do another round, and then I would pick up the stuff and do another round and grab my bag. I mean, it was literally insane, because everything you do, as you mentioned, everything you do is dictated by minority rule, basically.
Right. And learning how to navigate that, right? Learning how to navigate that. And that new sense of, I don't know. I don't know exactly how to do this. I know how to do what I was doing before.
Mhm.
I'd spent, most of my life doing that. And there is a little bit of, I mean, I was an older mom, so there was a certain amount of, and I also consciously chose to have a child and
Mhm.
consciously chose to have a child without a partner.
Mhm.
Um, and so there was a lot of appreciation, I think, for being a mom.
Mhm.
I also don't feel like I had a lot of time to bond with my mother, um, the way that I needed. And a lot of that was because there was a disabled child, my older brother, who was probably he was 5 when I was born, 5 and some change. And he had really high needs, still has really high needs. So there is that when he came in, it was like I'm willing to hold him for hours. I don't care because that's something that I needed. I needed that as well. But there was still that sense of, I mean, it's really interesting because it followed that line of grief from my mother, right? This not having, and then being able to just hold him for hours and hours and
Yeah.
hours. And he wasn't a napper,
Mhm.
nap, ever. And he just wanted, he slept like a good amount of time and he would wake up late, but he wanted to be with me the whole
Mm.
time, which was really great most of the time. And sometimes it was like I have to cook. I have to
Mhm.
feed myself. It's been days, I need to take a shower or I have to go back to work. What am I going to do? How am I going to do this?
I think that something that struck me there, when you have when you have your own child, there's an atavistic urge to be with the mother, and you lost your mother. Mine died in 2019. We didn't have a relationship.
Mhm.
So what I mourned was the relationship we might have had,
Oh
but
yeah.
didn't. So
Yeah.
there was this, that void was filled with this other longing that she wanted to come, but I knew it would be terribly destructive if she came, because she had certain ways of being that weren't compatible with raising a small baby
You
or
mean
looking
as
after a baby.
having her come as a grandmother and
Yeah,
be,
it would have been very destructive. We had to wait until Ali was a few months old before we were able to have her over.
mm,
But there was no sense, when you think of, I think of Alia now, when she sees me, I can see the relief on her face, and we get back into the comfortable way of being. I could never have had that with my mother. There was always this hyper vigilant, what's going to happen, what's she going to do, and I need to take care of her as well as this small child.
yeah. Yeah, and I think that's also something that I wanted to talk about because I think that, I mean, when my mother died, she died, I was 25. I had just gotten sober and I was in therapy and in my own grief process of what had happened, how did I get to this point? how did I get to this point where I didn't care about my life?
Mm.
Um, and I was really angry at her. And so when
Mhm.
she called to tell me she was sick, I didn't return her call. And she had to send me a letter because she called a few times and I didn't return her call. And then she called to tell me that she was really sick. Um, and I also felt that after she died, that just like how many times have I lost my mother? And how
Yeah.
many ways? To the depression, to her fear, to her overwhelm with my brother, to her overwhelm being a single parent of two kids,
Mhm.
to not having enough money. Like all of that stuff took years to kind of heal, really, in some ways. But it is part of
Yeah.
our grief with our parents. And the other thing I think that is really interesting, and I've watched this with friends, and I watched myself do it a little bit with my dad, but my dad was also older, was this, oh, now that they're dead, we can't open that box. We
Mm.
can't go back and say anything bad about them. We can't go back and say, that was really messed up, right? That there's the aspect of grief of, I can no longer be mad. I
Mhm.
no longer have permission
Yeah.
to find fault. And I have heard that a lot and I've seen that a lot and felt that in my own body. And it's given me, I had to tussle with it enough to be like, I have permission to say that was messed up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then there's also, the idea that we need a witness to this. We need a witness to grief, a witness to loss.
Mm,
Um, my brother, who's the last remaining person in my family apart from me, is dying.
mm,
He has a few months to live, and when he is gone, there won't be anyone left to witness with me what happened to us when we were children.
mhm,
Those will just be stories. They will cease to seem as real as they do now when when on the rare occasion we do talk about it. So there is this idea of creating a shape for grief with language.
mhm.
So externalizing it so that it becomes something,
Or
with
imagery, or
yeah, or
imagery.
imagery, whether you write it or paint it or sculpt it or dance it or sing it, whatever you do, it should be externalized for
Oh, I
your
love.
benefit from the body.
No, I just love how the whole art world is now associated with. But I mean, every once in a while, I was like, why are the wars happening? Why is this? I keep
Mm,
hearing that now, especially with the intensity, and oh, it breaks my heart. It's happening in Gaza, but um, I keep telling people we would have no movies, we would have no dance, we would have no art, we would have no opera, we would have no music whatsoever if everything went smoothly. Like
mm.
it's all heartbreak and betrayal and joy and
Yeah, and I think that the
love and
beauty
connection and
the beauty of art is it
grief.
transmutes that, right? It transmutes
Yes,
grief and loss into unutterable beauty.
right. Which is but I could see it in a different way when you said that. It was like, yes, but it almost feels necessary, or at least
Yeah.
for me,
Mm-hmm.
to reframe it and to make this thing that is so horrific into something else. Right. And it's also that transformation. I don't want to say my mother was horrific, but she was very challenged. Remember,
Mm.
you gave us a writing prompt once of what caused your mother's pain?
Who's responsible for the pain of your
Who's
mother?
your, oh my God, that was so, that was intense.
Thank you, Banu Kapil, for that quote,
That
for
was
that
so intense.
prompt.
Uh,
Yeah, and I mean, I think because we've used this analogy before. When Monet was painting the water lilies,
mm,
it must have been, I mean, what he held in his head as he painted the water lilies. I mean, you've seen it, it's just brushstroke, brushstroke, brushstroke. if you're close up to it, you have no idea. It's just color, a melange of color. But when you go to the other side of the room, and then it all makes sense.
Mm.
So sometimes what we're doing is just brushstroke after brushstroke. We have no idea what's coming, and our palette is mixed up completely. But then when we go to the other side of the room, then we can, oh, that's what I was saying. And part of the grief, perhaps, is the inability or the inhibition of articulation, because you just don't have the language, and language is so deficient in expression.
Yeah, it is. It is. Unless it's, and I love that you brought in the art piece, because I do think that it's sometimes the sound, right? Whether it's the moaning or whether it's a song. I felt when my dad died, for some reason I chanted a lot at night, because I felt like I wanted to just honor the space of his transition, and whatever sort whatever felt left undone, or soften it, right? Just allow him to have a nice, nice journey for both of us, right? That allowing him to leave, allowing it to feel clearer or cleaner, right? That I didn't have a lot of regret when he died. And I think that was helpful, because I did do as much as I could do, um, to be present and to take care of him and to say what I needed to say. I mean, we talked a lot about, um, his inability to show up. I wouldn't say a huge amount, but enough for me to feel like I was heard. And he also, which I was always really sad that my mother would never see me have a child, that she would never meet my child, which is really interesting, because he looks like my mother. Like he came out and he looked like my mother. And even my yeah, other people have said that his hair is like my mother, the shape of his face. It's really, really interesting. But my dad did. And my dad was able to witness me be a mom. And there were, I mean, I remember being in the kitchen and him crying and saying, I didn't do that with my boys. I didn't do that. I was like, what? What
Yeah,
did
it's so interesting. You're talking about the release of grief. We've been talking about how we channel grief, and it's a two-way thing. I remember my mother as well was shocked when I would carry Alia for however long it took while she went through the crying, the spasms of pain that she went through while she was enduring colic. And my mother said, how could you do that? And I immediately heard her say, even though she didn't say it, I didn't do that. I could never have done that, because she couldn't have.
Mm-mm.
And I thought, that's what she's been carrying.
Yep.
And so she needed my daughter in order for her to release that sense of guilt
Yes. And
from
I
herself.
think that goes back to that writing prompt, right? That you asking me about my mother, and how just the thought of, oh yeah. I mean, because I have thought about her pain before, but to think about her as a child with her mother, and my grandmother, who one was an alcoholic, but also lost her mother when she was 4, and
Oh,
just how that had come down through that generation of women.
yeah.
Um, and to see, my grandmother's pain and her drinking and oh, she lost her husband and her daughter very close together, and it just blew her out.
I want, and you have to think, okay, so how much of this is fear? Just numbing the fear of what happens if my granddaughter goes through this as well, if I die too quickly and she isn't taken care of. Because you've got to think about where these habits, these grief habits, come from, epigenetically. What are we carrying from our mothers and grandmothers and great grandmothers past in that inability to articulate, release genuinely release
Yeah.
and pain.
And I love that the Manachi shares that a lot, where she talks about when she talks about when I was in my mother's womb and I'm about 5 months old, or she talks about her mother, I think, like when her mother was in her mother's room and in her mother's womb.
Mm.
Her grandmother was pregnant with her mother, and her mother was 5 months in utero. She was making the egg that would become her.
Yes, yes,
So,
exactly.
and the sense of that grandma's nervous system and where she was emotionally, mentally, how she, you know, anxiety or depression or whatever else was showing up was impacting both of them.
Mm-hmm.
That was also her story,
Right, right.
and how it does get passed. Even just that, I mean, because we entrain together, right? When we're with somebody who's highly wound up and anxious and unsafe, we instantly go there.
Mm-hmm.
You can't, unless you have a very strong constitution, especially as a child, you just entrain to that, or an egg,
Yeah, yeah.
fetus.
I mean, any of it, it's, anger, the things that I have struggled with anger, to not be angry like my mother. And
Mhm.
yet when something happened with Alia when she was a baby, there would be this body burning rage that would enter me that was shocking, and I would have to walk out of the room and let it pass. That I was thinking, oh, this is what she went through.
Yeah.
So I do believe, rage is enmeshed there with loss and grief.
Oh, definitely. Oh, definitely. Definitely. I mean, I definitely spent years raging as a
Mm.
teenager. I was definitely a very angry teenager. Um, and I
I
know
think I just have to say, I think as young people, we often have those feelings dismissed. Oh, what have
absolutely.
you got to be so upset about? What are you angry about? You don't understand. So you're completely invalidated in terms of your emotions. But for you as a young person, your whole self is invalidated. And that's lost, then where are you?
Right. Absolutely. And that's our cultural weirdness. I mean, it happens in families, definitely, but it happens as a culture as well. I mean, I do think that I was the one who was, even as a kid, even as a little one, it was like this, my parents just split up and it went down really weird. And I was
Mm,
angry and didn't understand. And everybody wanted me to just be quiet and do what they were doing, which just was suck it up and go through it.
mm,
No, no, no. I didn't do any of the things that I was supposed to do. I didn't behave well around the new wife. I didn't behave. Um, got sent to therapy, both homes. But I
yeah.
see how that was me saying, hey, there is something, you guys, this isn't right.
Hmm.
How we're doing this isn't right. And it's taken me this long, I think, to give myself permission to speak up.
Yeah.
It's
So,
okay to say, this doesn't feel right for me in
so
any
important.
relationship.
The idea that we should, and we've talked about this a little bit too, that we should get over or get through grief or move on from grief. There's always this agitation to make us like we were, make us productive members of society, whether we're working or not working. Don't rock the boat. Don't bring your big ugly grief out into public. And so there's that judgment, which is so destructive. And having lived in other cultures, you know, America is really grief illiterate.
Yes.
So that we distance ourselves from death, we distance ourselves from grief, we distance ourselves from the things that are part of the fabric of living. And if we don't incorporate those into our lives, then we become stunted or unable to move in certain places or to understand that feelings are moving through us. And that's okay. So the idea of grief without judgment, I think, is incredibly important. There's
Yeah. And I mean, I know the younger generation is doing more grief ceremonies and grief rituals. And I know that in other cultures that they would do more movement, right? That people would get together and move and dance or moan together or cry together or move it through the body.
Right, right. I mean, the idea of moaning, storyteller Valerie Tutson introduced this concept. We did a workshop together and we were talking about, what do you do when there's great pain, when there's this sense of loss? And we were talking about, we were instinctively rocking as we started talking about this, and we were loosening something up. And
Yeah.
she was talking about, just moan, just open the mouth and let the animal out, let the sound out. And I thought that's just so important. It's such a preparatory stage to language. We always go to language as that's the fundamental source of communication. But prior to that is the moan. I mean, you think about women in labor, there's a lot of moaning and grief, apart from the Stoics who get through that. But so it's almost as though that needs to be coming out before we can birth something else. There
Yeah,
has to be that release.
I agree. I agree. And again, it goes back to that the primal and just the not intellectual, that grief isn't an intellectual process. It's an emotional process. It's a primal, it's physical. I mean, when you lose something, when you lose somebody or you lose your sense of self, it is, it affects every part of you, every
Mhm.
part of you.
And I should mention here, I mean, because we have talked about this a little bit, that losing yourself doesn't have to be the loss of a person or the loss of, some great loss. It can be the fact that at work you've been asked to move to a different cubicle,
Mhm.
which is south facing instead of north facing, or something that disrupts your sense of who you are in your workplace. And that's also loss.
Oh,
But
absolutely.
very often it's just, get on with it, move your stuff and get back to work. And there's a sense of dislocation, dysfunction.
There are many, yeah, many losses. Aging, moving, your child getting older,
Hey, losing your eyebrows. That
losing
was
your eyebrows.
that was a big one for me. I've got these weird, I'm so bad at drawing on eyebrows. They look wonky. But if I don't have them on, I look even more weird. But it's just where
Losing
do
your eyesight.
yeah, where do my eyebrows go? They just vanished. And it's just I've got these sort of strange staring eyes. So this is my moment for my big career change to go into
I
horror in
losing
Hollywood. I'd be really
losing
good.
body hair.
Yeah, losing body hair, losing body awareness, losing your sensory self as you age, as women age. There's, women very often feel that they've become sexless, and that's got nothing to do with their sexual urges. It's the way that they are perceived.
Hmm.
So they're not childbearing, they're not attractive, or they're perceived as not attractive. They may be beautiful, but they're past a certain age where they can bear children, so they're not seen in that way, and they can be completely ignored.
Oh, absolutely. I know. And I think that, I mean, I met another woman. We did a podcast too of with self-pleasure. And I think there's something about touch that we get less and less of as we get older. I mean, I think that was
Mm-hmm.
thing that I loved being a mom. And I've had women say, I mean, I had a woman say to me the other day, like, I don't want to be touched. It takes everything in me to let my child climb on me and crawl on me without flipping out and screaming and yelling. She's like,
Mm-hmm.
it takes a lot of practice because there is so much just old stuff that comes up.
Yeah.
Um, and I didn't have that per se, but I think there is something about the stages of just, I lost my train of
We were
thought.
talking about aging and sensory
Oh,
response.
yes, that I think that because I've been playing with this sense of the exploration of self-pleasure and this more subtle body movements. And I feel like, oh, it's coming back a little bit, that maybe it's just a depravity thing, that maybe it's just we stop touching ourselves because we think there's something wrong with it or somebody else should do it.
Mm-hmm.
Or just touch, like hugging people, or, COVID brought out a lot of fear. I mean, every once in a while, I have somebody come and put their hand on my back, and I'm aware of it because I'm
Mm-hmm.
aware of that for a few years, people wouldn't touch me,
Right,
right? There was so much fear of killing each other or being killed by each other, this whole weird
right,
mental
right.
that we got. Um, yes, and women, older women many women have said to me they feel invisible. Many,
Yep.
many.
And the idea,
And
I
men.
love this idea about touch, because it is the non language communication that does everything.
Yes.
You can't fake touch. So that when
No.
you touch someone's hand or you touch someone's face, you communicate so much without having to do any language prep or speeches. And it's so much more pure. I think this is when lovers, finally get together and or they have sex, and there's a stripping away. I'm not literally talking about the clothes, but there's a stripping away of the masks. We mentioned this at the beginning, that we assume. I think that's what everyone wants, to be seen and to be
Absolutely.
held, right? And when that is removed, what happens to your, I mean, there's a grief that's associated with that loss, because you've lost part of yourself. And who was that? That's just somewhere in your memory, or if you have children, there's evidence that there was touch at some point.
Yeah. And yeah. And not having a partner, right? That it takes more imagination and creativity to find that, whether it's through body work or, you know, spending time with people in person and with people who are want to touch or who are intimate or getting body work or I mean, it does. It's much less. I mean,
Maybe
when
we
you
should start running hugging workshops.
hugging workshop.
People can
And
just hug.
I look at my son. I just dropped him at prom on Saturday. I'm not always with the kids all
Mm.
the time, but anytime there's two kids together, they are touching each other.
All over.
They're patting each other and
Yeah.
joking and pushing and like
Yeah.
puppies. They're like
Yeah.
puppies.
Yeah, they're all. You look at a group of young girls walking along a street or down a beach or something, and they're falling over laughing, and they're holding each other
Rolling on
up.
each other
Yeah, exactly.
and holding hands and
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
It's so we don't do that as adults. We're like,
No.
we're trying to behave and be appropriate, and it's so weird. The over appropriateness of
Mm.
it becomes almost sterile or
Yeah,
um,
as though touch, or that kind of touch, is there's something immoral about it or something wrong with it. Is again judgment, right? So that we move further away because we don't want that. We don't want to be judged.
yeah. Well, and there must be, I mean, I think there is, I mean, I know as a woman, we went through a period. I remember when one of my friends told her daughter, you don't have to hug anybody if they ask you to. And I remember being like shocked and then going, how many times did I have incredibly inappropriate
No.
contact when I was a kid? And it's like, oh, okay, now it
Mhm.
makes sense. But then where's the balance of
Mhm.
what's, how do we feel safe with each other?
Mhm.
Right. I think that I definitely have felt that through COVID, right? That there is this lack of
Yeah.
safety with others. And even as I get older, that sense of how do I move in closer to people,
Mm-hmm.
right? That idea of consent, right? How do I get closer and get permission without feeling awkward or like I don't have the right to ask, or I don't want to speak up because I don't want to make this weird, or
Mm-hmm.
how do we get closer? How do we just invite each other in,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
say, I'm not ready for a hug right now, but I'd really like a hug
yeah.
before we part, or whatever it is.
Right.
Don't mind.
I do think, I mean, there's such a dance, a delicate dance anyway, with physical closeness and intimacy. And I think another source of grief, as you're talking about, is that the loss of all of that. How do we make that work again? Because it's not going to be the same. It has to look different. How do we relearn that? How do we teach ourselves and then teach the people around us what's okay and what's not okay? So that
Yeah,
when you meet somebody, do you just immediately stick your hand out because you don't want body contact, or do you go along with a hug?
right.
There's a grief in managing the body. It's
Absolutely.
as though we don't know our bodies anymore.
No, and there has been, there is the acknowledgement of that it didn't always feel good. And then
Mm.
how do we then move through that?
Hmm.
I know I had a lot of, when my son stopped wanting to hug, I mean, he was a very physically connected person. And then, at 7, he's like, we're not the same person. After telling me we were the same person.
Yeah.
And there was that separation. And then not wanting to hug me.
Mm.
I think there was 2 years where I would ask for a hug and he would say no. And so I stopped asking.
Mm.
Like just recently, he's been back to, so it's been this dance of, okay,
Mhm.
he's exploring his body and his boundaries and saying what he needs and being different than me, that's fine, but I want a hug. So I have a cat. But just negotiating with him of like how do we connect?
I think in that case, it can become so complex,
Yeah,
and we're
but
so
it's fine.
afraid of doing the
Even
wrong
with,
thing. But I think that's where people withdraw into themselves, and that's where grief takes over.
yeah,
Because you've not, you haven't harmed anyone, but you're harming yourself.
yeah, yeah, it's such an interesting dance. And even with, I mean, just kind of going back to mothers and mothering and what it felt like. I'm just trying to remember my own mother. And my mother's very small. I'm 5'3" now. I was a little bit taller. I'm shrinking, but she was 4'10" and a half. And
Oh yeah.
she was little. She weighed 85 pounds. So hugging her was like hugging a child.
Yeah.
She was little. Yeah, her clothes were, I couldn't fit in any of her clothes.
That's tiny. My mother was 4'11", and she shrank as well. But she wasn't, she was a little bit more substantial, I think, than your mother. But I think there's also this sense of, and I always feel it with Alia because I'm small, I'm 5 foot, and she's 5'6". And I always wonder, does she feel like she's being too? I don't think she does because she kind of leans her whole weight on me. You have to brace yourself against a wall or something for the incoming
Oh,
hug,
that's sweet. That's sweet.
which is lovely. When she was 3, I would carry her when she was sad. And I once turned and saw myself in the mirror, and I was holding her, and her feet were down by my ankles. So I hope she doesn't see this. I'll get
It's very,
affected.
it's very sweet.
But
I
I
think
think the going back to the idea of mothers and grief, which is kind of where we started.
I know, but I love that image. I just am savoring that.
It was, she was just very sad. If she was travel sick or something, I'd hold her. Mothers and grief. I think it's really important that we do talk about that, because without doing that, we perpetuate what we have struggled against.
Absolutely.
And then I think that's
Absolutely.
the danger of diminishing ourselves, caging ourselves because of the fear of dealing with the grief of our mothers.
Absolutely. I agree. And there is something, I think by not addressing it, it's like we freeze it
Yeah.
and it just gets weirder and gets carried
Mhm.
out and
And it gets passed on.
it gets passed on. Absolutely.
Children are like, they're covered in little sensory endings. They're like giant nerve endings wandering around and they suck it all
Yeah,
in.
I agree. Because I do think that I mean, I think I've had a few intense times, both when my parents died and then a few other, like the separation from somebody who's like a mentor, a mother figure,
Mm,
and then a man that I wanted to marry. But those periods of time were really intense, but they were also were some of the most transformational periods of my life. And I
mm,
think that even when my dad died, I wasn't afraid of the grief. I was like, I was aware. I don't know. I wasn't afraid of it. I kind of went into it and I was like, this is what happens. This
yeah.
is what it felt like when my mother died. This feels familiar.
Mm, mm,
It also feels like um, a repair, a time for repair.
right.
Cocoon
So,
of
so how do we talk to people who've not been through that, who are going through it for the first time?
yeah. I mean, I don't know if it's just sharing experience, right? Because I think that when we speak heart to heart, it's
Yeah.
really good. And everybody goes through grief differently, and everybody's influenced by the people around them
Yes.
differently.
I think that validation is hugely helpful because people are so scared of, I shouldn't be feeling this way. I remember, I think I told you about this young student I had at one time who was doing really well in the class and suddenly her grades dropped off. So I talked to her after class, is everything okay? She burst into tears. Her mother had died a year ago and she said, I know I should be over it by now. It was just, oh no. What made you think that? And it's, of course, you're going to be grieving for a long time to come. Your
Yeah,
grief is your new part of yourself. You have to learn how to make space for that. Where does that fit in your life?
it's huge. I mean, I think it's a huge transformation. Losing a parent, losing a child, those are huge
Yeah.
amongst others, but those are big because it's the reckoning of the relationship
Mm,
and it's the repair need that needs to come. But it also, again, I do think there's this walking forward, right? There's this walking forward in the relationship, even though they've passed, so that we can move things forward in our other relationships as we
mm.
mothers or partners or right if we don't
Yeah.
have children,
Yeah.
how does then that again that sense of creating a different form of energy
Mhm,
that's from that place of repairing any fractures or places that really felt
mhm.
impactful in
Yeah.
us.
And so that we remain available
Yeah,
to
to
the
life,
people around us and to life
to ourselves.
because it's
Yeah.
so easy to close down in grief.
Yeah,
And I think we close down in grief because we do live in a society that is grief averse. So
absolutely.
it's inappropriate to grieve.
Well, emotion averse, right? That we are supposed
Yeah.
to kind of kick ass and push through things and kill
Hmm.
it and dominate it and fix it. Like that's our culture. Our culture is very, we've got this.
Hmm.
We're just
Action driven,
fine,
right?
just gonna push through and push ahead and keep
Mm,
going
yeah,
and kudos to that. And I see how fragile we are emotionally,
yeah.
that come off very powerful and strong,
Mhm.
but strength is not force, it is not dominance, right? That
Mm-mm.
uh, you need to know how to yield, how to release, how to feel, how to
And how
be.
to bring other people into the conversation, I think, because because of this fact that it's so difficult for us to talk about grief, people may not understand how to join that conversation.
Absolutely.
And so it's important to, you know, as awkward as it may be, we have to start somewhere. Because I think people do want to be supportive and they do want to help. They just don't know what to say, or they're terrified about the idea of grief or
Right.
loss. So,
Well,
yeah.
that's where, again, that comes back to and I know that you're doing work in groups, because I think groups are really powerful because there's less, you know,
And what do you think?
there's less of one person staring at you, and there's more of, although that I think having support is really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
I was listening to this man today talking about, he was just talking about a therapeutic process, and somebody was asking him if this is something that could be done on your own. And he said, some people can, and some people have gone very far. And then there's many who can't.
Yeah.
They need hand holding. And he said, when I'm in those places that are really vulnerable and tender, he's like, I need a witness. I need somebody there with me.
Mm-hmm.
And
Absolutely.
but his presence is very, I, I think one of my teachers would call it an empty vessel, an empty cup, right?
Mm.
There's this sense of space,
Yeah.
right? Just creating a space that they feel safe enough or can access their voice
Mm-hmm.
to share something that feels unshareable in the rest of the world,
Right.
right? The shame
Exactly.
around I'm having feelings and it's messy and I want to cry and
Right.
I'm angry and I don't understand and I feel abandoned and I feel angry about this point and I can't get over it. I keep replaying it and they're gone and nothing can change. You know, there's so much that needs to be moved through, and sometimes we can't move through it by ourselves.
Yeah, it's too much. And I
It's
think there's also the the fact that, you know, if you do go through it, what more will you lose? What other loss will I sustain if I do actually move into this? Will I ever come out the other side?
right. Will it engulf me,
Yeah,
take over?
absolutely. I strongly believe in having a group around you, even if that group is two other people or one other person.
Or one other
It's
person.
so important to have that.
Kitties are helpful too. Or
Yeah,
dogs or guinea pigs or
someone else's baby.
stuffed animals or
You can borrow a baby for about 20 minutes or something.
borrow a dog, borrow a baby.
They have programs in hospitals where you can go. They want people to come in and hold babies who are just born, so they get that skin to skin.
Yeah. I actually have a mother and daughter client. I see them separately, but
Yeah,
they go once a week to hold babies. And
and
that's part of
yeah,
that's
I
their
feel I
repair
want
work.
to do it, but I would feel terrible because I'd want to take the baby with me, and they don't allow you to do that.
No.
So I have to be a bit careful. But yeah, I think it's necessary. One of my friends who's a social worker, um, she said they went through specific training for loss of children and, you know, grief associated with that. And one of the things they showed them was, you know, it was very difficult film footage, stillborns and, you know, all that kind of stuff. She said the worst thing she ever saw was a group of Romanian babies who had been abandoned during the war, and there was no brain activity whatsoever because they'd never been picked up and held.
I mean, I can't imagine that. I mean, I know that that happens, that babies who haven't been held are very high risk of dying,
Mm-hmm.
but just to come out of this, a human body, of living in a human body and come out and then not have any contact must be just horrifying, terrifying.
I don't know what happened. You know, you think about the next generations coming in these wars that we're seeing. It's going to be horrific.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Although one thing that um, I feel very grateful to witness in just the Palestinian culture is how much they hold each other,
mm-hmm.
I mean, sometimes that makes me cry because I'm like,
Yeah.
they have something that we don't have that we don't know how to do.
We're good at standing stiffly by each other at funerals. We're very good at that, and
We're
wearing
good,
the right clothes.
right.
But you know,
Right. We're
but the
good at
whole,
we're good at a lot of things, but not we are very individualistic. We're very much get your, pull your bootstraps up, get your shit
Mhm.
together, do it on your own, otherwise you're weak.
Yeah,
Um, and I don't think that that's what is helpful. And I think that people are realizing that more and more.
yeah,
But
yeah.
for me to see that community, and I did grow up in a Latin culture, and I saw that around me,
Mm,
right? Whereas the white culture is very, my mother's side of the family was very rigid and stiff, and
mm,
people very rarely came over, and they had to schedule a week in advance. And
mm. Yeah,
my side, it's like people just drive over and walk in the house, eat your food, and hug you,
yeah,
kiss you, and yell, and it's just different
yeah.
different culturally. And um I think there is something about, I don't know what it is, but it's that disconnection that may be part of our culture. And I think that in some ways it's organized that way.
Mm.
And I would love in my own life to challenge that and to create.
I think the work that you're
And to,
doing does absolutely challenge that. It's all about connecting to the body and connecting to touch. So you're doing that anyway.
yeah, and then how to take that out, right? Because I think that
Yeah.
when we connect to our body, I mean, one thing is that you then connect to your emotions.
Mm,
And then that means, how do I become responsible for my emotions? So if I'm lonely, how do I learn how to connect?
yeah.
I'm, if, or if maybe I need more time for myself, maybe I need to step away from people and figure out what I think. Because
Hmm.
if I'm in a group of people, I don't know what I think. And if they're telling me what to think and it doesn't feel right, oh, look, now I'm finally aware of it.
Hmm.
Finally aware that it doesn't feel good. And how do
Yes.
I find what feels right?
Right. Yeah, that's important too.
Yeah. Okay, my dear. Is there any, I think we need to wrap it up. So is there any last, I don't know, thing that you want to say or express? It doesn't have to be about anything in particular.
I think in terms of just what we've been talking about grief, inexpressible grief, inarticulate grief, if that's going on with anybody that's watching this, is just a huge encouragement to find support. And I know it's just find support, how do you do that? There are resources like in Portland. We're starting a particular group. There's another group. Our group is called Feathers. There's another group called the Grief House. There are support groups around there that don't force expectations or make you stand up and witness or something like that. There are places for you to go where you can experience grief and be held with respect. So I would just encourage people to maybe do that because it will be so much more healthy for you and you'll learn how to live with what hasn't been possible to articulate before.
Yes, I agree with that. And I know that there are, depending on what people feel comfortable with. I know at our local library, I mean, this is more specifically about death.
Hmm.
It's called the Death Cafe. And I've
Oh, okay.
just any questions or any sharing that people want to do, because sometimes it's their own fear, the fear of their own body,
Yeah,
or grieving somebody
yeah.
else's.
Or maybe, the people who are listening to this might respond to you and
Yeah,
maybe.
either one of us. I will put our information down so
Okay.
um we both hold space for people.
Mhm.
And if we can't do it, we might be able to help you find something, uh,
Definitely.
or even just validate that where you are in your grief process
And
is.
we should be very clear about the fact that neither of us is a trained counselor. We're not offering therapy or advice. This is witnessing and providing community for people so that they don't feel so alone. You are not alone.
No, you are not alone. No. So thank you so much I always love sharing space with you.
Me too. Thank you, Padma, for inviting me.
And again, if anybody has any question, I will put information, just even a question of whatever comes up to you about mothering, about grief, about being held in grief. You can even share your story with us.
We would love that.
We would love that. All right. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you, Sandra. Really.
Thank you, everyone.